Hello fourth year students, here is your lecture Literary Criticism entitled Dante from the Middle Ages. You know that we are moving in a chronological order. We are starting from the classical period, then we directly move to the Middle Ages with Dante. Only Dante we have as an example, because actually in this period we don't have let's say important or significant literary theories. Dante himself wasn't actually a literary critic. He was a poet mainly, but there are certain parts that we found in his book, The Divine Comedy, specifically from Paradiso, the introduction to Paradiso, in which we found that actually Dante proposed certain concepts, we can say, or thoughts or ideas concerning the way that literature should be written or interpreted. So historians actually believe that this was kind of let's say a hallmark, or we can say a progress, or we can say that this is a kind of a theory that we can place it in the history of literary criticism, because actually it has a certain impact, certain influence on literary criticism as a whole. So in this lecture we are going to see what is Dante's contribution to literary criticism. Before we start with Dante as a literary critic, let's see first the Middle Ages, the time in which Dante lived and wrote. So during Renaissance, humanism, of course, you know, Renaissance is a very long period. When we are talking about Renaissance, we are talking about a period which starts almost from the 13th, we can say, century till I guess we can say 15th or 16th. So it's a relatively long period, and the time in which Dante lived, the Middle Ages, it was Renaissance. So what is so important about this period? We have a movement which is called humanism. Okay, humanism. It was a popular movement. It is a movement that focuses on man away from religion. So basically, we can say that this movement is more concerned with man himself, his inner, we can say, feelings, his inner self, away from the influence of religion, away from any, let's say, religious rules or theology. This is, we can say, in a very simple statement, we can say that actually this was the start of the separation from religion. So man began to place himself at the center of the universe instead of God. So it is all now around what? Man, what he thinks, what he feels, what he needs. It's not anymore about God, because, you know, when we speak about religion, we are mainly talking about God, worshipping God. So now the focus has shifted from, let's say, religion and God to man, and only man. This was the, let's say, humanism, this movement which we can say started in this period. As a result, they began to search for their own answers through observation and experimentation. This method was called empiricism. So now man has to find for himself his own beliefs, instead of taking them from, let's say, any religious source. Now he's creating his own beliefs, or let's say not creating exactly, but now he is observing and then making experiments in order to see whether these observations are true or false, and then he reaches to certain theories, or let's say certain beliefs. And this method actually reminds us of the, let's say, the scientific method. In scientific method, this is the steps that we follow. We start with observing something, we observe a phenomena, then we make test, we make a hypothesis actually. This hypothesis either proves that this observation is valid or invalid or false, and then based on certain maybe experiments, we can say, or certain let's say a certain procedure that the man could follow, then we could reach to a certain theory or at the end, and this theory could become a belief. This method is called empiricism. In Arabic it's called التجريبية, النزعة التجريبية. Okay? Throughout Dante's work, he emphasizes the concept of humanism. So Dante actually was not away from this. He was really influenced, and he was one of the humanists, and he emphasized this concept. The critical methods developed in biblical commentary were gradually secularized. Here, this word is really important, and it actually expresses very well what we mean by the humanist movement and how it influenced society back then. So what does it mean that you secularize the critical methods in biblical commentary? So the Bible, of course, wasn't just a book that when you read it you take the literal meaning. Now you have to we can say interpret. There are certain parts of the Bible couldn't be understood unless they are interpreted. So there were methods actually that were used for this. The idea was that Dante proposed actually, that this method could be secularized. What does it mean to secularize a method or something? It means that to take it out of the domain of religion and make it more, let's say, related to the domain of the physical world, the human world. بالعربية مرات يقولون علمنة، لكن احنا نقولها جعل الشيء دنيوي أكثر, more related to man, to his life. So this is what we mean by secularizing, and used outside the domain of theology, as humanist thought developed in the wake of the 12th century Renaissance. So this was actually the result, one of the results of this development, that we start to take these methods, critical methods, instead of just using them in the Bible, try to use them outside the Bible, maybe in interpreting any literary text, whether a play, drama, let's say a novel. We don't have novels at that time, epics, poetry. So this was the idea. Like Longinus, you remember Longinus, we studied Longinus in the classical period. Dante is concerned with the proper language for poetry. And so the first thing that Dante was concerned with is language. What about language? Well, basically what you need to know is Latin was actually the language of a lot of things. It was language of literature, language of law, language of the Bible itself. So language of science, we can say also. Until now we can see the traces of Latin language. There are certain terms that are still in Latin language, and they are used as we can say as basic terms in science, even in the Bible, even in laws. It is just because it was one day Latin was the most important, or let's say the first language, just like English today is one of the most spoken languages in the world. Dante states that the language spoken by the people, the vulgar tongue or the vernacular, the language, the ordinary language that is spoken by people in ordinary life, the slang, we can somehow say this is what he means, is an appropriate and beautiful language for writing. So why use a language like, for example, Latin, which we can say not all people are accessible to this language, not all people know how to speak it, or they don't speak or write with Latin. Latin was mainly actually, when we say that it was the language of religion, we see that those, let's say, religious people, like the priests, maybe those who work in theologists, we can say, they used to let's say excel in this language. They know how to speak it, they know how to read it, because it's the language of the Bible. Those who work in science, those who are scholars, who work in law, for example, lawmen. So it was language easy for them. But what about the other people? What ordinary people? So this was the first thing that Dante proposed. Why not use the language that is spoken by people in order to write literature? This makes literature what? More popular and accessible to a wider audience. Okay, so in his letter to Can Gran de la Sala, which serves as an introduction to the Paradiso, you remember I said this? Dante establishes a classification of the elements which have to be taken into account in a literary work. So this is number 2. The first thing we knew about Dante is his concern with language. Now let's see what are these elements he's talking about that should be in any, or let's say should be taken into account in any literary work. Number 1, to wit. And wit, when you search for it in the dictionary, I think you can find interesting meaning. It means a kind of smart, or being smart, or being wise. And here I think he's talking about talent or genius, the ability to write. Okay, so you have to be talented. This is, if you remember, this was something that Longinus said. Remember? The subject, what are you talking about? What is your main idea? There should be a main idea. Number 3, agent. What about the characters? What about your those who are supposed to do the action? You remember also Aristotle actually was concerned with this one when he said the tragic hero, when he gave us the definition of tragic hero. Form, the form of your work, form and end. You should follow a certain form. For example, you start with a certain let's say beginning let's say in any way, and then you reach to a certain conflict in the middle. At the end there is a kind of outcome to your story. So the form, if you are talking of course about drama, or if you are talking about for example epics, in epics, you know, there are certain conventions, certain rules that you have to follow when you are writing the epic. It has a certain fixed specific form, so you have to pay attention. And this also was something that Aristotle also emphasized, the idea of having a form. The title of the work, you have to pay attention to what title you give to your work. And then the branch of philosophy it concerns. What are you talking about, or what's the message behind your story or poem or epic? What is it mainly about? What is the philosophy behind it? So now you see in between these inverted commas, these are the words of Dante, right? Writings can be understood and ought to be expounded chiefly in 4 senses. So this is number 3. Now we have what? Number 1, 2, and then this is a 3. What does it mean to have what? 4 senses, 4 meanings. This is what he means. So there are 4 levels of meaning in a text. This is, let's say, the method that Dante is using in order to interpret or criticize a literary text. What does this 4 levels of meaning method means? So the critical method of interpreting a text depends on 4 levels of interpretation of 4 meanings in the text. So any text, when you want to interpret this text, you have to pay attention, according to Dante, to what? To 4 levels of meaning. The first one is called the literal meaning. I think it's very clear. This is that sense which does not go beyond the strict limits of the letter. So this is the surface meaning, we can say. That when you read a statement or when you read the text, the meaning that reaches to you from what you have just read, this is the literal meaning. You don't go beyond the letter or to understand any deep meanings. Number 2, or let's say the second level, is allegorical, or we can say symbolic. It is a truth hidden under a beautiful fiction. So sometimes when you read this text, and it is of course literal meaning, it seems to you that it is not enough. There is something behind this. So when you go deeper, you find that actually there is a symbolic meaning. This is something that you already saw when we were studying Crossing the Bar. When we were studying Crossing the Bar, you remember we said that the poem has 2 meanings. There is a surface meaning and we have the deeper meaning. How did we know? Actually, when we analyzed the poem, we were able to detect these 2 meaning, literal and symbolic or allegorical. Actually, we said this is allegory, if you remember that. Number 3, moral meaning. is that for which teachers ought, as they go through writings, intently to watch for their own profit and that of their hearers. So as a writer, you have to pay attention to what? To certain moral message that you can convey to your readers or hearers, just like it is said here. So here he's talking about a level of meaning in which there is a moral message that is communicated. The fourth one is anagogical, spiritual. The highest level of meaning which enables the reader to be elevated by the spiritual truth embodied in the text. So the highest level of meaning that any text could reach, according to Dante, is the spiritual one, that there is a kind of spiritual truth that you want to communicate to your readers. And I believe actually this level of meaning is a result of the influence by the methods that were used in the Bible, because you know the Bible is a religious book, so there is this kind of spirituality that you can find in it. So I believe this is a trace of because this method actually was used in interpreting the Bible. So in literary text, I don't think that we do have such texts that reach to this level. Maybe I'm not saying we don't have at all. I'm saying just not to the extent that we can expect that we could find spiritual meanings in a lot of works of literature. Maybe there are some of them, a few of them actually. So I believe this is the influence of using critical method that was used for a religious book, the Bible. But this is of course Dante's theory here, that he believes this is the highest level that could reach, that a text could reach to, and it conveys a certain spiritual truth to the reader. Well, what else do we need to know about actually Dante's contribution to literary criticism? Tragedy and comedy. You are familiar, of course, with these things. Tragedy and comedy. Tragedy is a story, or let's say drama, in which we have in the end maybe the death of the hero, the death of many other characters, while in the comedy we have a happy ending. So but here for Dante, tragedy and comedy are simplified to a difference in the outcome of the story. Just this, I mean, he doesn't believe that actually there is any important difference between them. They are also seen as kinds of fiction and not as dramatic genre. You see, just kind of stories. Why does he think like this? Dante's work is a poem. You remember the Divine Comedy, but actually when you read it, it's not a comedy. Dante's book is not a comedy, but although it is not a comedy, it is called the Divine Comedy. So why this contrast? What Dante is trying to say here is that when we use the 4 levels of meaning method in interpreting any text, then how can we differentiate whether this text is a comedy or tragedy? Maybe sometimes the writer uses a comic scene in order to reveal or in order to communicate a certain tragic or serious message. So in this case, how can we tell whether this is a comedy or tragedy? You see, this is what he tries to convey here. This is the idea that if we use the critical method that we have used in interpreting a text, which depends on 4 levels of meaning, what does it do? It actually undermines the possibility of reading meanings different from the explicit ones. So sometimes a serious message may be found under an apparently unworthy cover. Okay? So this is his point here. Finally, what are the possible themes that we could find in any literary work according to Dante? Of course, when we use the vernacular language, when we use the ordinary language, what does this mean? It means that we should change also the topics, the themes that we are dealing with in poetry. So he speaks of 3 possible themes available to vernacular poetry: the state, الدولة يعني, love, and virtue. See, and I think actually they are very popular themes. So these are the main themes that he believes could be good for poetry, for vernacular poetry. Dante claims that the lyrical song is the best poetical form. So no, actually, this is that we what we expect actually when we use vernacular language and we are talking about themes which are vernacular. Then which form is more suitable is the lyrical. We cannot, for example, use the epics, or let's say we cannot use the sonnets. The best, or let's say blank verse, the best thing to use is the lyrical song. So this was all for Dante. If you have, of course, any questions, you can ask in our group in Telegram. Thank you very much for listening.